Hello, everybody. So, programming. No more Rocket League talk in the chat. So we've been working on this thing for a while now. Everything we've been doing has sort of been like a fake so far, using like a fake payment gateway and stuff. And I think it's time to try and wire it up to Stripe so we can push through some real full-on requests and kind of see what happens. So before we do that, I have one little refactoring that I wanted to do that I've been thinking about for a while since the last stream. On the last stream, we kind of refactored this ugly controller code. So we had this like checkout object instead of having all this payment gateway logic inline in the controller. And it meant we had to pass a bunch of parameters around everywhere. Like here we're passing the email, the company name, the slots, and the sponsorable. Here we're passing payment gateway, payment token, and then the API key to use. And I think this can be simplified or at least moved around in a way that feels a little cleaner to me. So the first thing I wanted to look at is just some like parameter order here. So originally we had this sponsorable at the end, and usually I kind of think of parameters in a function in like descending order of importance. So like the really key parameters I usually stuff at the front, and then the stuff that's either more optional or just, you know, less crucial to what we're doing is usually closer to the end. And in this case, the sponsorable was right at the end because the only thing we were using it for was to grab its name as part of this like statement descriptor or charge description. So I realized after the stream when I was looking at this code that the API key that we're using for completing the checkout actually belongs to the sponsorable. So we don't even really need to pass this parameter through, right? Like if I delete this parameter and head back to the checkout class, instead of accepting it here, I can just get rid of that and ask the sponsorable that we already have a reference to for its Stripe API key. Hold on a sec. And if we've done this right, we should be able to run the test and everything still passes. So that's pretty cool. And what this kind of made me realize, at first I kind of had a little bit of, I was a little conflicted about if I wanted to do this. Like, did I want to make the checkout responsible for sort of reaching into the sponsorable and grabbing the API key? And I wouldn't do this in the payment gateway because I want the payment gateway to be as sort of oblivious to our domain as possible. So you can see right now, like the payment gateway, it doesn't know anything about the fact that there's sponsorships or podcasts or anything in this app. It's really just dealing with kind of payment specific stuff. So I definitely wouldn't want to do that sort of thing in a class like this. But in this class, it doesn't bother me too much. And the thing that this made me realize was if we're leveraging the fact that we have the sponsorable to grab the API key, I feel like that kind of promotes the sponsorable from being kind of like the last sort of straggler parameter up to being sort of a key parameter, right? Like we're making a checkout for this podcast. It kind of becomes really, really critical. So I think what I want to do is kind of rearrange this parameter order a little bit. So why don't we move the sponsorable and the slots to the beginning, since those are kind of like together and really crucial. So let's just cut this stuff and paste that at the beginning here. And then we'll swap slots for the sponsorable. And let's just head over to the controller and make sure that we move those parameters around here as well. So grab the sponsorable, that'll go first, then the slots, then the email, then the company name. And all the tests still pass, so we're still good. So we've been able to remove one parameter entirely, which is a win, I think, and organize this parameter list in a way that feels a little bit less arbitrary to me. The last thing that I think I want to do is, you might remember on the last stream, if you watched it, I was talking about maybe introducing this idea of like a customer object, which would really just be like a data structure just to sort of hold an email address and a company name, because those are kind of two pieces of data that are tied together, right? Like I wouldn't be passing one around without the other. They're sort of like bundled up. I think this is like kind of unnecessary. I don't like creating objects that don't have methods, because this would either just have two public properties or it would have like getters, right? It wouldn't actually have any behavior. So it kind of feels like a smell to create a real object for it. But I think I'm totally fine with still bundling them together into like an associative array as just like one step closer to being an object, but not quite an object yet because it hasn't really earned that. So the nice thing about Laravel is we can easily do that here by just doing, I'll just type it fresh so you can see it. So Laravel has like this thing where we can do like request only, right? And we can just ask for the fields that we want. And that'll give us an array with just those two fields. You can actually shorten this though. You can get rid of only completely. And if you just pass an array into request with the list of keys that you want, it'll do the same thing. So that lets us cut this stuff down, which shrinks this line down, which feels a little bit better to me. So now it's only 97 characters, the whole column or the whole row. So it's, a little bit better. And then in the checkout, instead of accepting an email and a company name, I think what we would do is we would just accept like a customer. And we would just think about it as almost like a, just a plain JavaScript object, right? Or a data structure. Like in JavaScript, you wouldn't feel bad about passing around like key value pairs. You do that all the time. So I'm trying to convince myself to not feel as bad about doing that in PHP either. So then down here where we're doing like this email, we might do that in two places. So we'll do customer and grab the email as a string, the email key. And then same thing for the company name. So we can just grab this and replace that with company name. And honestly, it feels a little bit nicer to me. So now we only have 3 parameters here: the sponsorable that we're purchasing, that we're trying to sponsor, the episodes that we want to sponsor, and then like the customer data. So it feels a little bit better, even though it's kind of superficial in some ways. I do think it's a pretty significant improvement. I haven't tried getting my Sublime package to work with Hyperterminal. No. I don't even use it with iTerm. I use it with the built-in Mac terminal. So it's kind of funny how it works actually. If you look at like purchase sponsorship test or something, if I run an individual test, it opens up in the regular Mac terminal, and then I just literally command Q to quit the whole thing every time I'm done running a test. And I keep iTerm open where I run the whole test suite. It's kind of a inconsistent workflow, but I'm okay with it. All right, so I think that's a bit of an improvement. So why don't we commit that? So I pulled in the Stripe PHP library just so we wouldn't have to do that on stream and wait for that to install, but we'll commit that separately. So let's just say refactor checkout parameter order, basically, something like that. And then here we'll just say pull in Stripe API library. Pull in Stripe API library. I never type in anything because I think it's silly and doesn't have any advantages in PHP since they're not actually checked until runtime. And they limit the solution space a little bit. There's things that you can't do if you type int everything that you can do if you don't. And we have an extra space here. I don't want to get into it too much because it's like a whole big topic. But I did a whole podcast episode on Full Stack Radio, my podcast, about it a couple years ago. That's not the commit I wanted to amend. Oh well, it's fine. I haven't done a lot of testing with Vue stuff yet. That's still something I would like to get more practice with and figure out. Right now, I just kind of test that stuff manually. Stuff that's just like UI stuff, I find is always really gnarly to test in general, and the tests end up being kind of brittle. So I haven't done a ton there. So yeah, maybe one day. All right. What are we going to do? Yeah. Okay. So the thing that I want to work on is basically building a real Stripe version of this payment gateway so that we can swap it out and use the real thing when we're actually running the app. So I'm going to start by making a test for it. So the artisan make test Stripe payment gateway, and we'll make it a unit test. So we're going to try and drive out this whole test basically here. And this needs to have test at the end. And we're going to integration test the whole thing against the actual Stripe API. So yeah, we'll see what happens. So a couple things. a concept that we're probably going to get into in this stream is this idea of contract tests, where something I like to do when I'm creating these like API adapters, if I have a fake, I want to make sure that my fake and the real one kind of have the same methods and behave the same way. And I don't want them to get out of sync. So a good approach that I've found for doing that is to basically create like shared test cases where I have test cases that I can run against both implementations and make sure that from the outside they behave in the same way. So we're going to get into that for sure, but we're going to just have to figure out what we're doing first. So I think let's grab the fake payment gateway test. And maybe we'll just start by copying one of these tests and manipulating it to suit our needs, because ultimately we're going to want to be able to run the same tests against both. So why don't we start by just copying it in, and then once we kind of got them both working, we can extract the duplication. So we'll copy this test in. So basically, we want to be able to test that we can make charges and retrieve them back from Stripe and verify that they are actually working the way that we want them to work. So let's create a new Stripe payment gateway here instead of a fake payment gateway. All this stuff I think is going to be the same. Actually, we're going to need to change a couple things. So let's look at the Stripe API docs for a second. So the first thing I'm looking at is this valid test token thing, right? We want to be able to ask the payment gateway, give us what you consider to be a valid test token. So we're going to have to look at Stripe test token documentation. They'll tell us tokens that you can use that are kind of considered valid. So Toke Visa, for example, is something that we can use. So we'll ask Stripe to use a valid test token. So why don't we just go ahead and run this test and see what the first error is. Okay, so there is no Stripe payment gateway class. So let's create that. Artisan make model Stripe payment gateway. It's not actually an eloquent model, but this is the fastest way to generate it. So we'll just delete this stuff. Okay. Let's make sure we import this now. Run this again. Call undefined method Stripe payment gateway charge. Okay, so let's add a charge method. We'll just leave it empty. We'll try and do this without thinking as much as we can. Try and let the tests do the work for us. Call the undefined method valid test token. Okay, so we need a valid test token. Okay, run the tests. Call the undefined method charges. Okay, so some interesting things about Stripe's API that are going to affect how we write this test. If you look at the Stripe API docs, you can retrieve all the charges on an account, which is useful in this case for us. But the problem is there's no way to clear out the charges. So normally in a test, right, you have like there are 4 phases of your test, right, which is like arrange, act, assert, and then there's like a cleanup phase where if you did anything to like change the file system or change external state somewhere, you want to kind of clean up after yourself and reset some state. Stripe doesn't provide a way for us to do that via the API. So if we create a charge, there's no way for us to delete that charge. You can delete all of the test data in a Stripe account, but you have to do that through the dashboard UI. You can't do that through the API. So the problem there is that every time we run our tests, we're going to be dumping new charges into this fake Stripe account. So that means that if we ask for all of the charges back, we're going to get charges from previous test runs, not just the current test run. So the way to get around that is using these kind of like markers that you can use in the API to basically say, I only want this window of charges. So here we can say, using ending before, we want all of the charges that, so in this case, okay, for instance, if you make a list request and receive 100 objects starting with obj bar, your subsequent call can include ending before obj bar in order to fetch the previous page of the list. So starting after is the same sort of thing. And what that'll basically allow us to do, if we are smart, is we can query the API to find out what's the most recent charge. We can take that charge ID, store it, run our tests, and then only look at the charges that happened after what was the last charge before we ran the test, if that makes sense. So all that to say, it means that we can't just do something as simple as payment gateway charges to get the charges that happened during this test. We need to come up with like a more clever API. So something I've done in the past that I kind of dig is to do something like charges during, where we give it a function, and maybe the function will take the payment gateway so that we have access to it without a use statement. And then inside here, we do the charging so that the payment gateway itself can sort of keep track of, okay, at the beginning of this call, it can find out, okay, what's the most recent charge, run this code, fetch the charges back from the API that happened after the most recent one, give them back to us. So this is kind of like a way to sneak around that and make it possible for us to get just the charges that happened here. Any reason you don't look at the Stripe response? I don't totally understand the question because we haven't done anything yet. Do you mean like when you actually do the charging, getting the IDs back? That's one way to do it. I don't dislike that method. The thing I like about doing it this way is it's kind of like even more black box. It's kind of like I'm not even trusting that this is even giving me the right Stripe API ID back. By doing it this way, I can just sort of say, okay, we're trying to make some charges, and then after the fact, I can just go and look at those charges separately and see which ones were there without even inspecting the results that I got back. To me, it mimics more closely what I think I would do if I was just testing it manually, right? Like I would run the code, then I would look at the Stripe dashboard and look for the charges instead of trying to match up IDs that I got back necessarily. But both approaches can work, but I kind of like this one. So this is one that we're going to roll with. Okay, so if we run this, it's going to fail, right? Call the undefined method, Stripe payment gateway charges during. So since this is just like a test helper, we could try and write tests just for this, but I'm not too stressed about that. I think we'll just try and get it working so that we can use it as support for our other tests. So let's write this charges during method. Charges during callback. Okay, so let's run this. Assert count must be countable or iterable. So now we're just getting garbage errors because nothing's working. So let's just work on a basic version of what charges during might look like. So if we look at what it looks like to list all charges with Stripe, right? It's something like this. So let's write this using modern PHP. And we actually just want to get a limit of 1 because we just want the first most recent charge. Something I kind of like doing for these API adapter classes or stuff that integrates with external stuff is not importing vendor directory stuff and just using the full namespace. It makes it more obvious to me when I'm reading the code which classes are mine and which classes belong to a library that I've pulled in. So let's just do something like this for a second. And we actually need to specify a second parameter here, which is the API key that we're going to be using. So we're going to probably want to make sure that we specify that. So this is a little different than other ones that I've written. So we're going to want to use like a real Stripe account. And if I'm not mistaken, in our database seeder, we actually have like a test key. Or where was I keeping that test key? Was it in our model factory? I'm sure I have this somewhere. Example API key, maybe it's in the other test. Or maybe we didn't actually use that yet. So let's grab one. We'll go to Stripe dashboard. And if people want to mess with stuff here, you know, that's kind of lame. So don't do it. But it's fine because these are just generated tokens that I can roll and revoke, and it's just a test account, so it doesn't even matter. It's not a live account connected to a bank account or anything. All right, so let's just grab this. Ultimately, we probably put this in like an environment variable, so any other developers working on the project can have their own Stripe test accounts. But for now, we'll just kind of put that in as part of this API. So we're going to need the API key that we're using for tracking these charges. And yeah. Then I think we'll probably want to update. In this case, it's kind of tricky because we're trying to test like fetching stuff for multiple accounts, and I don't really feel like setting up multiple accounts right now. So we'll just maybe use the same account for all of them for this test. We can extract this to something somewhere, but for now I think it's okay. All right, so let's just run it again and see where we're at. Argument 2 must be countable. So that's basically charges is not countable. So nothing is doing what we want it to do. So why don't we start maybe by just like dumping this charges results and seeing what we get when we are doing this. Okay, so we're getting a Stripe collection with no data. So I'm kind of curious what methods exist on that to make things easier for you. But it sounds like basically we need to get data, and that's going to be the actual charges. Okay, so that's empty. So one thing I'm curious about is, can we go to, let's create a fake, we'll create a fake charge here for a second. Manually created, or whatever, test charge. We'll just say manually created test charge. And maybe if we do this, we can see if we actually can fetch that back and see the results when we're actually running the test, right? So a lot of what we're doing here is just kind of like exploratory. We're trying to learn how everything even works. So it looks like we do get an array back now. It has like a Stripe charge item in it. Okay, so it sounds like we can get the most recent charge by just getting data 0, right? And this is obviously not going to work if the array is empty. So that's just kind of like a case that we're going to have to think about and handle. But we can say like last charge is that. And let's just dump last charge and run this. Yeah, so we get this manually created test charge. And it has an ID, and we're gonna need that. So let's just see if we can access the ID. Again, I don't know off the top of my head exactly how you manipulate stuff here. Okay, so that seems like it's working. Okay, so sounds like what we want to do is run the callback passing through ourself, because that's what we're doing here, right? Charges during. Here's the callback, takes the payment gateway so that we can use it without adding a use statement. Not that it really matters. And then after we run the callback, we basically want to be able to return the charges that happened during it, right? So we can do something like charges equals. And then if we take this same code, but instead of doing data 0 and instead of doing limit 1, we do something like, what was it? It was like starting after. So we want to get stuff starting after last charge ID. And if we DD charges here, that'll be like one step in the right direction of finding out if our code here is working. Okay, so that's giving us nothing. So we ran this code and nothing happened. So charge method exists. It has no methods or anything, or it has no parameters. It doesn't actually do anything. So we're going to have to work on that next. So let's work on getting charge to work. So we look at the fake payment gateway. We'll just copy the signature from there. And then we can basically translate this into like a call to Stripe. So if you look at create charge, we can just copy their code here as a starting point for now and replace all these stupid double quotes with single quotes. And the source is going to be the token that came in right here. API key is going to need to be specified. Let's use square bracket array instead of this old school array. So here we'll do API key is API key. The description, we have that coming in as a parameter too, so we can use that. The currency, we'll just hard code the currency to USD until that ever needs to be configurable. The amount comes in as a parameter, and then email is something that we're going to need to specify. I think we can specify that somewhere. If you look at like the actual structure of this thing, it can be kind of hard to figure out where everything goes. There is a customer, I think. Either customer, the ID of a customer. Okay, so that's not what we want. Receipt email, the email address to which this charge's receipt will be sent. Okay, so that's probably the one that we want, receipt email. It's weird to me that there's not another email field that we have to specify. That's okay. We'll use a receipt email. It might actually be part of the token because the token has the customer's email in it. But yeah, let's just do it as receipt email for now. We'll put this up at the top. We might have to sort of just metadata or something if you want to later. Okay, so let's just see what happens. Invalid request must provide source or customer. Interesting. So the problem is valid test token is not returning anything. So let's update valid test token to return toke visa for now, just like a hard-coded thing. It's gonna be really slow because it's actually hitting Stripe's API every single time. And we're getting an empty array back still. So let's see what happens if we refresh the dashboard. Okay, so we got an empty array, which is bizarre, but the charges did seem to go through, the ones that we created during our test. So let's try and think about what we could be doing wrong here. So we run the callback and then we ask for the charges starting after the last charges ID. And that was coming back as empty. Kind of want to run it again. We might have the starting after and ending before backwards. Sounds like that's probably the case. Okay, so let's switch this to ending before. It's not very clearly named. If you look at like the Stripe API reference, so let's kind of read this here. Ending before. So if you make a list request and receive 100 objects starting with obj bar, your subsequent call can include ending before in order to fetch the previous page of the list. Yeah, that's unclear if they mean stuff that was made after or not. Next page of the list. Yeah, okay, so ending before is the one that we want, I think. We can verify this by changing these values for a second. Let's just change all the 5s to 3s, or 73, whatever. And run this for a second, and just see that the 3 that come back now are the right ones. It looks like 33, 3,000, 7,300. Okay. So that code is working. Let's get rid of the DD, and we don't want to return the charges directly because if you look at our fake payment gateway, we actually have this like charge object, which is like our system's charge. So I think we're gonna want to translate the Stripe object to match that. So I think we just want to do something like return, collect, charges, data, map, function, Stripe charge, return new charge, and then this charge object, we create them here, email amount description. We're probably going to want to store the charge ID as well, but let's just do email amount description for now. I guess we'll have to get that from receipt email. Again, that kind of feels funky to me that it's receipt email and that there's no other email field. But let's roll with it. So we'll get Stripe charge, receipt email, Stripe charge, amount, and the last one was the description. Stripe charge, description. Cool. Yeah, and that should give us back the 3 charges. Now I think it's going to fail because I'm pretty sure these charges actually come back in most recent to least recent order. And here you can see we're looking for this one, then this one, then this one, which is the order they were made in, but I think they're actually going to come back in reverse order. So let's see. It's going to be slow. Probably the whole problem. Okay, yeah, okay, so this is kind of the expected problem. So let's change all these zeros to 2s. Oh. This one can stay a 1. And this can be 0. And let's sort them so that they're in the order we expect. And this is going to be one of those subtle details that is going to be a slightly different behavior compared to our fake payment gateway. So we'll have to make sure that we make that consistent. Good book recommendations. My favorite programming books are probably Practical Object-Oriented Design in Ruby. The RSpec book is a really good testing book. Growing Object-Oriented Software Guided by Tests is good. I like this book, Agile Patterns, Principles, and Practices in C# by Uncle Bob. That's a pretty good one. Ken Beck has some really good stuff, like the Original Test Driven Development book is good. He's got another book called, it's called Smalltalk Best Practice Patterns, but he also kind of rewrote it in Java, which is maybe a little bit easier to understand, but I can't remember the name of that one. Okay, so this test passes now, which is kind of cool. So we wrote something that actually like hits Stripe. So let's tweak this for a second. We don't want to get item 0 necessarily because item 0 might not exist. So I think what we'll do is an array get here where we try to get item 0, which will return null. And then if that comes back as null, then we don't want to specify an ending before. So I think we can use data get to get last charge ID. I think that's a real thing. Let's just see if that still works right now. Yeah, I still use valet for everything. Yep, so that still works. So, and I bet if we, let's go and clear out all our dashboard data. Business settings, data, delete test data. So let's delete all this stuff and run it fresh and make sure that it works on a fresh account. Cool. So the little changes we made there made it a little bit more robust if someone's using a brand new account that doesn't already have charges, but still works for everything else. And this isn't real production code that we're going to be using in the app. It's just for testing. So we don't have to be super fancy or super crazy clean here or anything either. Yeah. Give me 1 second. I just got a call from my wife. She doesn't know I'm doing a stream. So I just need to let her know. All right. So that's kind of neat. So that tests that we can retrieve all charges that were made. In this case, it's really just retrieving all charges for a specific account. It's kind of like the real test here. Like, the only way that we could test that this isn't retrieving charges for a different account is to also put in the token. I'm not going to stress about that too much because we just kind of know that it's impossible for you to make one API call with Stripe and get charges for other accounts. So we could go down that path, but I don't think I'm going to do that right now. Okay, so yeah, cool. I kind of think like this is, let's change this. Let's say, I don't want to name this retrieving all charges for a specific account because we're not really testing that. This is just kind of like something we need to do to assert that we can charge. You know what I mean? So how about test making charges for a specific account? That's what we're really testing. Testing that we can actually make the charges. So the interesting thing about this is that currently this is the only thing that the Stripe payment gateway even does. Same with the fake payment gateway. It's just like charge, right? Like that's the only method. So if we wanted, we could actually swap this out and test it out in the real app. And I bet you it might work. So I kind of want to try that before we go any further. So if we look at our app service provider, you can see that we have a payment gateway interface. And we're binding the fake payment gateway in its place right now. So I think what we need to do is bind the real payment gateway in place of that. So right now we have this interface called payment gateway. It has no methods on it. The fake payment gateway doesn't even implement it because we're not actually enforcing that it needs to be implemented with a type hint or anything. But let's do it just to be kind to ourselves and to any other developers who wanted to read this code. So we'll have the Stripe payment gateway implement payment gateway as well, which is really just like a marker interface right now, but let's change that. I think the only method that it really needs to have currently is charge. But again, our tests are actually going to be the thing that our contract tests are going to be what really prove the interface. So this is just kind of junk anyways. But yeah, it's good for the purposes of binding things in the IOC container and resolving things against different, class names and stuff. So let's just put the Stripe payment gateway in here instead. And I don't think it even has any constructor parameters, right? Normally I would construct this with an API key if I was building an app where I was only going to be making requests for one person. But in this case, because of our current design, we're making calls to multiple Stripe accounts. We have to kind of specify that API key at call time every single time, so it's not even a constructor dependency. So why don't we just go and refresh this for a second. Open up DevTools to the Network tab where any real problems are inevitably going to reveal themselves. And just try and purchase these two things. So we'll do company name is going to be like example company. Do Adam at example.com. Let's just see what happens. 500 error. No surprise. Invalid API key provided. Okay, so the problem here is we seeded the database with like a non-real API key, and we aren't yet handling client-side errors and stuff properly. Although this does make me think that maybe we should have maybe we should test this situation from the outside, but maybe not. Because it just shouldn't ever happen. The user can't control this. Oh, I guess they kind of can because we're going to expect them to paste in their API key. But for now, let's just head over to our seeder and update it to use this same test key. And I think this might be the only thing that we can get done today, because I have to keep this stream a little shorter than I was planning, because my wife needs me for some baby related stuff. So let's just see if we have done enough to write one test that talks to Stripe and get things actually working once we've replaced some stuff. So we'll buy these 3 episodes. Example company, adam@example.com, and pay, and please 500. Darn. Call to a member function amount on null. Interesting. So what's happening here? Let's check out the checkout class. And where do we call amount? Charge amount. So something is happening where the Stripe payment gateway. Okay, so we have a mistake here. So this is interesting. Trying to think what the best approach for testing this is. Basically, we're capturing, we're making some charges, but we're not converting these into our own charge after they happen, which is probably something that we should be doing, and we should probably drive that out with a test. So you can see like these ones are working, right? The ones that like we fetched back from here, but we're not actually making assertions about the actual charge that's happening. So I think maybe a good way to do this is to write another test. I'm just going to call this test making multiple charges for specific accounts. And here we're just going to say making a charge for a specific account. And we're going to rework this test to grab the charge back here. And I guess we're just going to keep this one at the end. So this way we can verify that the return value of the charge method is what we expect. And we can also make sure that we can make multiple charges and fetch all that stuff back from Stripe's API as well, which this kind of proves that like it's actually talking to Stripe, because we could implement this in a way, because like this is just like the fake payment gateway test, right? Like there's nothing here that sort of proves that we're talking to Stripe. Whereas how we have this set up where we're trying to say, okay, we want to fetch the charges back from Stripe. This kind of proves that happens in a little bit more of a concrete way. So let's run this test, and I think we're going to see pretty quickly that same problem. So call the member function email on null. So let's make sure that we keep a copy of like the Stripe charge that comes back, and then we want to return a new regular charge, which is actually just going to be this line. And we'll grab it from the Stripe charge. We could just use the stuff that came in here, but I think it makes more sense to grab it back from the Stripe value. Okay, so let's run this again. Okay, so that's green. And let's reseed the database. And refresh and grab these 3. Example company, adam@example.com, blah, 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 blah. And let's see, did we succeed yet? Hey, 201 created. So if we go and check out our database, we should see that there's a sponsorship for an amount. The sponsorable slots have been assigned to that sponsorship. The sponsorship has my email and company. And the part that we didn't have before, now if we look at payments, you can see a full stack radio sponsorship came through for $14.25, and this is the one that we made. So now, if we wanted to actually put this into production, it's not beautiful or perfect in every way, but there's actually enough here that we could deploy this, point it at some real Stripe API keys and stuff, and people can actually purchase stuff with real money. So that's a pretty good progress, I think. There's some stuff that we're going to need to do to write some contract tests to make sure that our Stripe payment gateway and our fake payment gateway stay in sync. Maybe we can dedicate like a whole stream to that next week. But for now, I think that's where we'll finish off. So thanks for checking out the stream. Hopefully you picked up a thing or two, and I'll see you on the next one. See ya.